Okay, good morning, everyone. So we ended last time with some discussion. We'll kind of fill in some gaps there shortly, but I want to start talking again about this guy Kangxi. So just as kind of review, remember Kangxi, one of the most important emperors in all of Chinese history, really cool guy. One thing that I think is really striking about him there, he's in this difficult situation where his father dies while he was still just a boy. And remember, that's very dangerous. Right? Remember, the Yongle Emperor in the Ming Dynasty had pushed aside the grandson of Zhu Yuanzhang and took power. So it was very possible that Kangxi might have been pushed out, especially by his regent. Remember, the regent is the person who's put in charge of helping to guide a young king. But at the age of about, I think it was 15 years old, Kangxi said, "Regent, I can do my job myself, thank you very much," and successfully pushed this very powerful man out of that position and started ruling himself at 15 years old. Right? That's pretty impressive, I think. Right? I certainly would not be ready to rule China by the age of 15. Certainly also not by this age either. So that already shows us this is an amazing person, right? Even though he comes to power young, he's able to rule effectively. He faces two major challenges in addition to this. You can say there's three major challenges. That's the first one, just getting power in the first place. The second is how to deal with this Usan Gui guy. Or Usan Gui, I'm sorry, is it Usan Gui or Gui? Gui. Okay, thank you. Usan Gui. Usan Gui, remember, he was the guy who had the army between Beijing and Manchuria, and after the emperor had committed suicide, it was up to him whether he was going to let the Manchus in or not. And he decided to throw in his lot with the Manchus. He didn't like the rebels. He thought the Manchus would do a better job. And as his reward, he was given a large amount of territory to govern as an official. Right? He's like a governor. However, he was hoping to pass it on to his kids. He basically wanted to become a king. That would, of course, meant the splitting of China. Right? If he would have become a king, and there were two other guys similar to him who also wanted to do the same thing. And what ended up happening then is Kangxi decided, we got to deal with this situation now before it gets worse, and he's going to pressure Usan Gui to retire. You're an official, it's time to retire. Right? You've served me for many years, I appreciate it, but you're old and you deserve the opportunity to rest. So please retire. Very polite, but trying to get rid of him. And he realized this, and he and the two other people like him will rebel. This is called the Rebellion of the Three Feudatories. Right? That's from 1673 to 1681. So Kangxi's only 19, and he's dealing with a major rebellion. And it takes 8 years, but he leads the Manchus to victory. And this really puts the Qing on a solid foundation. Right? This really puts the Qing on a solid foundation. Now, we need to talk about Taiwan now. And one thing I want to point out, first of all, that's very complex today that we need to understand is this. This is the People's Republic of China. And people usually, when they say China, they mean this. This is considered by the island of Taiwan is considered by the People's Republic of China to be a breakaway province. Right? It's not seen as an independent country. Taiwan is also called the Republic of China. It claims officially that it is the true government of China. So you can't recognize the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China at the same time. Right? For many decades, the United States said this is the true government of China. We don't recognize the People's Republic of China. That changed in the 1970s. So it's important for us to understand how this became a part of China. Right? This island of Taiwan, this is very important. Right? It impacts politics today. And if you've been following the kind of protests that have been going on in Hong Kong, the People's Republic of China wants unification with Taiwan, or what they would call reunification, and they want it peacefully. Right? They don't want to have to invade or something like that. That would kill a lot of people and it wouldn't make sense. They want a peaceful unification, and the idea is we'll have economic and cultural integration, and then one day we'll peacefully unify. Were the People's Republic of China to come in and just crush the protests, and they could if they wanted, they have the power. Right? The People's Republic of China has the power if they wanted to crush the protests. There's reasons why they don't, but one reason is that would make the Chinese people living in Taiwan to say, we don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China. There are a significant number of people in Taiwan who want to be to be reunified and to accept the People's Republic of China government as their government. Tianyu, is that fair? Is there anything you would add, or did I? Does that sound okay, or anything you want to put in?
I think you are.
Okay, I just want to make sure because I'm trying to be fair and objective.
Yeah,
it's not easy to do. But how did this become a part, in a sense, of China? Why would Chinese people think this is Chinese and should be reunified? Right? A lot of that has to do with what's going on in the Qing. Initially, the Portuguese had actually conquered Taiwan, and it's sometimes called Formosa, which means the beautiful island. Later, they get kicked out by the Spanish, who they get kicked out by the Dutch. Then what will happen is a Chinese pirate will basically take over, a man named Koxinga. And I'm really destroying his name because it's not a traditional Chinese name, I think. But he will take over. He's interesting because his dad was a Chinese pirate, his mother was Japanese. And a lot of time what's interesting, Chinese, in the sources will talk about Japanese pirates. Half the time these Japanese pirates were actually Chinese pirates working with Japanese people to engage in acts of piracy. But what's interesting about Koxinga is he is a Ming loyalist. Pirates are very complex and really fascinating. Dr. Floyd, I don't know if they'll ever teach it again, taught a class on pirates, which I think is really cool.
I would love that.
Yeah, they watch a lot of Johnny Depp movies. But Koxinga is a Ming loyalist, and he hates the Qing, and he fights on behalf of the Ming. So, in a sense then, mainland China has been pacified after the rebellion of the three feudatories, right? This area here is safe for Qing rule, but there are still Ming loyalists here. And Taiwan is a big place. There's no reason why they can't invade if the Qing ever become weak. And of course, they're pirates. They can really cause trouble to the Qing's maritime shipping, right? So this is a big problem. The Manchus, Kangxi Emperor has to deal with this problem. And they're going to have to fight. The Koxinga and his Ming loyalist allies will fight the Qing bitterly. The Qing are a good land empire. They're not a good naval empire, right? They don't have necessarily effective navy. And these guys are pirates. They do nothing but be navy. So they have a hard time, but they ultimately do defeat Koxinga and his forces, mostly because one of his former admirals betrays him, right, and helps them out. But eventually the Qing do prevail. Right, so this is, in a sense, how this becomes a part of China. Right? Why do Chinese people think of this? Why are there even Chinese people in Taiwan? There weren't really many Chinese people in Taiwan in this time period. Well, this is why. Because this has become a base for these Ming loyalists and this pirate who was a Ming loyalist. Now, the Qing engaged in a generous peace. They said to most of the pirates who had been fighting against them, okay, we beat you, you guys, as long as you promise not to bother us anymore, we'll let you live. And so they're allowed to live on the island still. And the Qing will occupy the island, they'll send military forces, and they'll set up a naval base. They want to make sure that no one can get a hold of this territory and threaten them. And what's interesting, though, is that they don't want trouble, so they actually try and limit immigration. They don't want a whole lot of Chinese people immigrating here because they don't want the native population, what are today typically called Aborigines. I don't know if that's the correct term, but that's what they're called in Taiwan. They want to protect those people from having all these Han Chinese immigrate in. Right? If a lot of people immigrate in, that will cause conflict and instability. So they don't want that to happen. Spoiler alert, a lot of people will move in. A lot of Chinese people will move in. So it's interesting, this is called Fujian Province, right here. And so a lot of Chinese people living here speak that dialect. Right? They came from there. Incidentally, a lot of those people are also called Hakka, which is kind of a group within China. David, I know you were asking me earlier about the Taiping Rebellion. They were Hakka, and a lot of them came from there. Just as an aside. So this is how this island is going to become a part of China. And you can see this is a big deal today, and it's affecting how the Hong Kong protests are being treated. Yes, Dylan?
Isn't Taiwan considered a democracy? Because I had a Taiwanese student in my class, and that's what he said. Yeah. I believe. So.
Republic of China, Taiwan is a fully functioning democracy. They have a constitution that it's a liberal democracy, I should say. It's very similar to the United States. They have free presidential elections. The party that loses hands over power peacefully to the party that wins. So it is what we would consider a democracy, or I should say a liberal democracy. There's different kinds of democracy, right? But I would call it a liberal democracy. Now, here's the other thing we have to consider, and this is important about the Qing. Let me turn off the light to make this a bit clear. If you look at the Ming, dynasty, this is about the size of the Ming dynasty. It forms a nice square. But like I said, the People's Republic of China today includes everything here but Outer Mongolia. Right? People's Republic of China today includes this area. Right? And it gets its size from the Qing conquest. Right? It gets its size from the Qing conquest. Right? This was all that the Ming was. But the Qing will continue to expand. Right? Once they pacify China, they will conquer these areas to the north, especially Xinjiang. This is an area that you may see mentioned in the news quite a bit, issues with the Uyghurs. But this is this area called Xinjiang. They will conquer. Tibet is a little bit more complex. Right? Tibet's a little bit more complex. I don't think it's correct to say they conquered Tibet. They didn't actually conquer Tibet. They're going to rule Tibet in a very different way. And one thing I want to emphasize, right? First of all, just so we're clear, this gets really confusing. China is a part of the Qing Empire. It's not the whole of it. Right? The Qing dynasty rules China as its most important part, but it's not the only part. So let me give you an example. Right? This is the Yongzheng Emperor. We're going to talk about the Yongzheng Emperor later. Very interesting emperor. But this is the Yongzheng Emperor. And can you guess what religion is he connecting himself to here? That's the emperor right there. Right? Just so we're clear. But what religion does this maybe remind you of?
Buddhism.
Buddhism. Yeah, he's connecting himself to Buddhism. And in particular to what we call Tibetan Buddhism. He's connecting himself to Tibetan Buddhism. So this is the Kangxi Emperor, an image of him. This is the Yongzheng Emperor. Don't they look very different? In this image, the Kangxi Emperor is presenting himself as a Confucian scholar. How should Confucian scholars dress? They should dress simply. And what's on his lap? A book. And just so you know, these are what Chinese bookshelves look like. A little bit different from Western bookshelves, but these are books behind him. This was on purpose. Remember, the Kangxi Emperor tried to say, I am a Chinese emperor. Or, I'm sorry, I'm a Confucian emperor. I respect Confucianism. So when he presented himself to his Chinese subjects, he emphasized that he was a Confucian. When the Yongzheng Emperor, he of course presented himself as a Confucian to his Chinese subjects, but when dealing with Tibetans, he presented himself not as Confucian, because the Tibetans didn't much care about Confucianism, they weren't Confucians. They cared about Tibetan-style Buddhism, so he presents himself as a Buddha. So that's the idea here. So in a sense, you know, and this is very important to how the Qing rule, they are different people for different parts of their empire. So like I said, China is a part of the Qing Empire, not the whole of it. So what here, and one thing we also have to emphasize, you may say, why would the Manchus keep expanding, right? So one thing, and this is also, by the way, true about Russia. Russia was a great expansionist power. To a certain degree, it's also true about the United States. But here's the problem. If you're a land-bound country, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with security? Let me give you an example from one of our maps. Korea, it's fairly clear. Korea has very clear boundaries. Korea is a peninsula, so it's clear what these three boundaries are. And there's a nice river, the Yalu River, up here. So Korea has pretty clear boundaries. Japan is an island nation, has very clear defensible boundaries. Right? Korea and Japan have very clear boundaries, easily defensible. And they don't change much. If you look at a map, Korea and Japan don't change all that much, at least over the last few hundred years. China, in contrast, where's their boundaries? It's not clear. China doesn't have clear defensible boundaries. Think about Switzerland, right? Has very clear boundaries, right? Surrounded by mountains. So China doesn't have clear boundaries, neither did Russia. So the problem is, when you're a land empire and you have insecure boundaries, you tend to have to expand. Because if you're not expanding, people are unifying against you and you're contracting. Right? So land empires like Russia, China, and to a certain extent the United States have a tendency to try and expand because we don't have clear defensible borders. Notice we Americans, we stopped our expansion for the most part once we got to California. I mean, we got Hawaii. But for the most part, you know, we were like, okay, we have clear boundaries now. Mexico, Canada. Right, yeah. It's a little complex when you get to the United States. But the idea is we got to a certain point where we said we have secure borders, expansion isn't as important. Russia never gets to that point. One reason China is very concerned about its border areas, you can always see this as a major issue in Chinese politics today, same reason. They don't have clear, secure borders in a way that a country like Korea or Japan or Great Britain have. So there's always this desire to expand. So for example, the Kangxi Emperor was really nervous because there was this group of people called the Zungars. They're kind of like Mongols. They're these horsemen who are really effective fighters. And he's afraid that they'll ally with the Russians. Another expansionist empire, right? If you're China and you're Russia and you're both expanding, that's kind of dangerous. But it's not clear where should the borders be. You know, you don't have a nice river, you don't have a nice island. It's not clear. So what's interesting, and this is important, remember how I emphasized that China had this understanding that it was like the central kingdom and that everyone just had to accept that the Chinese were the, you know, the son of heaven and just better than everyone else, and you had to kind of, you know, acknowledge your inferiority. They were willing to drop that when necessary. So when they made a treaty with the Russians, because they were afraid of this alliance, they made a treaty with the Russians to try and establish borders. They dropped that and they treated the Russians as equals. So again, sometimes people think of China, in this case talking about Qing China, as some place that they don't stop, they're too formal, they don't change, they're too traditional conservative. No, they're willing to change as needed. They had this system where they were the overlords, they were the big brother, they were supposed to be the center, but when practical reasons intervened, they were quite willing to change. Right? In this case, they made a treaty, a modern treaty, with the Russians as equals. One thing I want to point out, who helped to broker the treaty? The Jesuits did. Remember the Jesuits? They're allowed to hang around in China because they do useful things. They're the ones that did it. And 3 years later, I think it's interesting, the Kangxi Emperor officially tolerated Catholicism. He issued an edict that said Catholicism is a good religion, right? Because they helped the government. China will also expand into the northwest, taking Xinjiang, and this is conquest, right? This is them, the Qing going out and conquering. Tibet is different. Tibet is not conquered. Right? What will happen in the case of Tibet is there's a civil war in Tibet. Right? There's a civil war. You know how like there's the Dalai Lama and there's these incarnations? There were like two groups of people who each claim to have the Dalai Lama. And they will intervene and settle the civil war. And they will make Tibet into what we call a protectorate. Right? A protectorate is like a country that's independent except in terms of foreign relations. If that makes sense, right? So it's basically they're allowed to run their internal affairs, but their foreign relations are under someone else's power, and so they're considered like the Qing are their protectors. Incidentally, Qing officials were here, but they were never Han Chinese, they were always Manchus. So this is where, again, there's this kind of issue that will happen later on. Tibet was part of the Qing Empire. Tibetans recognized the Qing Emperor as their emperor, but they didn't see themselves as being part of China. China was a separate part of the Qing Empire. Right, we'll talk more about this later. When the Qing Empire breaks apart, this all becomes an issue. Because, like I said, there's this question, how big should China be? Should China include Tibet? Right? Should China go out from its main borders to include these other areas and include different kinds of people? That's a question that they have to kind of settle. So that's a little bit complex. Any questions about that? Okay, so a few announcements. Remember, there is a review quiz for this week, so do please make sure that you complete that quiz. There are also, I just want to go remember, there is the reading quiz 3, so make sure you complete that. There was the 2 readings, Pictures Draw Tears of Iron, the part of Making of Modern China. And please note that I might choose questions related to the study reading guides, and those can be on the exams. Now, I'm not going to typically ask you, like, you know, especially when I'm not going to ask you ones that focus on a person's name, right? I won't ask you to identify, you know, who's Kung Mu Yu or something like that. But I will ask general questions that you should be able to understand if you fill out the reading guide, right? You should know, in a sense, who did what. And I'll be clear, I'll say, the magistrate in the comment The Feud, or in the reading The Feud, did what? I might ask that, but I've clearly identified it, right? I said it's the magistrate, and this is the reading. So do make sure that you do that. Please, please. One thing I want to point out, the average grade on the reading quizzes is an A. Most people are getting A's, but some people are really struggling. My guess is they're not doing the readings. The reading quizzes are worth about 20% of your grade. So if you don't do that, then the best you can get is a B, but you're more likely, frankly speaking, to get a D or an F. So do make sure you do those. Like I say, they come back on the exam. The writing assignments will be on them. If you're having trouble with it, let me know. I'm happy to help you with that. And both those quizzes are due by 11:59 p.m. Sunday, so keep that in mind. So any questions about upcoming Okay, so I just want to go over, let's see, we did that part. There's a couple things I just want to go over quickly to make sure people understood them. So remember, Huang Li Hung, like I said, I'm not going to say, just his name and expect you to know his name, but on the test I may say, in the movie The Feud, or in the reading The Feud, Magistrate Huang Li Hung had some difficulties. Which of these, is one of those difficulties, or something like that? And remember, this guy had a hard time, right? He had a very small staff. His staff fought with each other, right? Remember that? His soldiers fought with his police officers, right? It was really bad. And they all beat up on the grooms, the guys who took care of the horses. His horses, he didn't have enough horses, and they were all sick. And people stole the food for the horses for money and stuff like that. I mean, this guy had a hard time, right? He had a very difficult time. And then, one of his officers who was generally good was buddies with Wang San, the leader of the armed thugs in the region. I mean, his high-ranking officer, the one he can trust, is drinking buddies with a major criminal. This is hard to be a magistrate. And that's what I mean. The exams picked smart guys who were flexible. Dylan, question?
Do you think the drinking buddy might have known about?
I think he totally knew and tipped him off.
Yeah.
Because remember, and I'm glad you pointed out, because when they try to actually do their duty, right, when he tries to capture Wang San, he's he tells people, yeah, I'm just going to go inspect some stuff, don't worry, it's not a big deal. And then he changes his movements to try and trick them, and they still find out. He took all these great precautions to make sure no one knew where he was going. They totally knew where he was going. Someone totally informed on him, and I think it was the drinking buddy, like he said. So, this guy has a really hard time. He does succeed eventually, right? He does succeed. He's smart. He organizes things very well. But remember, when he does start to actually fight, he doesn't have enough soldiers. Quan Mingyu, right, the village head, intervenes with more soldiers. And then he's actually the guy that gets the ball rolling, because remember, he has a cudgel. If you're not familiar with the cudgel's like a big hammer made of wood. Right? It's like a huge mallet. And he hits, I love this story, because he hits the son of Wang San and knocks him out. Knocks the guy off his horse, right? Which is it's wonderful. And he's the guy who really turns things around. And I want to stress, right? He's completely different from everyone else. Everyone's scared of Wang San. Remember, we mentioned this last time, but I want to emphasize this. Why was he the one guy that was willing to stand up? Wang San had killed his younger brother, and he was extraordinarily angry.
He has nothing else left to lose.
Right, yeah. And in Chinese culture and civilization, right, if someone hurts you like this, you need vengeance. Right? There's a saying, I don't recall the Chinese, but there's a saying in Chinese, you can't sleep under the same sky as the man who killed your father. Right? You cannot sleep under the same sky. Is it in Korean too, Diane? Yeah, so this spreads out, right? You can't sleep under the same sky as the man who killed your father. It means you've got to kill the guy. He's dead, or you have to die trying. Right? So this is important. You can see how this could be a strong motivator. But again, this shows the weakness of the government. The magistrate himself could not do this alone. He needed a guy who wanted vengeance. So again, this is a broad government, but not necessarily a deep one. And I'm going to point back to this. And of course, Wang San dies of wounds. Right? He dies of wounds he incurred in the battle, so they're not able to kill him and torture him like they wanted to. Now what's striking is where the Wang family had been found guilty of a very serious crime, killing multiple members of the same family. Right? Chinese crime, in American law, murder is just murder. But in Chinese law, killing multiple members of the same family is really, really bad, in part because it just shows social instability. It means that you have a feud, and you don't want family feuds, right? That causes massive conflict in society, but also threatens the continued existence of the family. Right? You want to make sure you keep having sons so you can keep having ancestor rights. So this was a major crime, so not only did you punish the people who were guilty of, the Li family, remember those are the people who all got killed, or not all of them, but most of them got killed, they were supposed to get Wang San's property. Right? So if someone killed your family, killed large members of you in this way, as part of their punishment, they had to give you their property. And Wang San should have given them a lot of property, right? The Li family should have been wealthy. They weren't, were they? Right? Yeah. Jeffrey, you're shaking your head. What happened? Do you recall?
Yeah, I remember, for example, they had most of the stuff out and not there.
Yeah, exactly.
And they try to hide it so no one know how
right.
wealthy they were.
Yeah, exactly. We'll hide it across the province into a different province, right? Remember that? And he had a good buddy there, right? Wang Sun had a good buddy, someone who had passed a high exam and was a very powerful person. So they just said, we can't do anything. Right? Too powerful. Don't question.
But couldn't that magistrate that started this whole thing do yet another investigation to find it out?
It would have destroyed him. Someone would have gotten him. He wouldn't have been able to do it. Remember, the guy was too politically connected. Can't touch him. Right? So there's nothing he can do about it, even if he wanted to. I mean, you're raising a good point, but this is, again, the weakness of the government in that sense. Remember we talked about the gentry-government alliance that was necessary? This is one of the problems with that alliance.
So it basically means all those confusing teachings and the exam system, 90% of it goes to naught. I say 90% of it because there are some generally good people like that magistrate that want to do their duty. Their hands are tied.
I wouldn't go so far as to say 90%. You're going to find corruption in any kind of pre-modern society. I mean, you see this kind of thing in England and other places like that during this time period. I mean, think about the American party or what's it called? Like Tammany Hall and stuff like that in 19th century United States. I mean, that doesn't mean democracy's 90% bad. It just, human beings make governments and human beings are frail, morally. Oh, we got that. Oh, yes, Armir.
On that last question, when you said why didn't they receive it, it's because they hid.
But there were two answers. One is that a lot of it had been hidden outside the province and was under the protection of a powerful person, a powerful member of the gentry. And you just couldn't, magistrate is too weak to go after that guy. He's politically connected. This is as far as we can go. At least you got your vengeance. You may not get money, but at least the guy who did this to you is dead, right? But yeah, that's kind of the problem. We'll talk more about that later. But, right. Any other questions? Okay, remember the second reading, we kind of went over this, but just to make it clear, the few women did not have a good position in China. You can see how if you were women, you would also be craving vengeance, right? Because you were often mistreated. And the author, right, the guy who wrote the first story about the guy who always wanted vengeance and would get angry and kill people, he loved his wife. And if you read, one thing I think is funny, if you read that whole book, The Death of Woman Wong, he really praises his wife. Like one thing he said about his wife, he said, my wife, she was so sweet. If someone gave her snacks and I was out of town, she would save the snacks. She wouldn't eat them. And then by the time I got home, they would spoil. But, she just was that good of a person. But even he was patriarchal as all get out, right, in his stories. The women are just there to be, they're just secondary characters. They're just not important. So, the other reading, though, remember we talked about that the other reading, the comic, was based on this novel, The Good Earth. And The Good Earth is fascinating. Right? It's written by this woman, Pearl Buck, an American woman, but remember she was born in China. And so she actually learned Chinese before she learned English. And it's wonderful to read the original book, because if you don't know Chinese, that's as close as you can get to reading Chinese in English, if that makes sense. And so she had this deep knowledge of Chinese language and culture, as it was among the peasants, and she had a deep love of Chinese people. And so she tried to portray that reality. A lot of Americans reacted with horror because she discussed, peasant life and all of its sexuality. She talked a lot about sexuality, which, if you read this, it's very tame by our standards, but it was kind of shocking. Many Chinese people were upset because she portrayed the reality, right? Many Chinese people wanted to kind of show China as this modernizing country, but she wrote a book praising peasants, about how the peasants were great. So it focuses a lot on that, and in particular it focuses, I like it because it shows how gender and family worked in China. Also, if you read the whole book, you got an inkling of this, it talks about how there was social mobility. One thing that's fascinating about China that makes it some way similar to the United States was this idea that you could rise in society. In this story, they start off as poor. The wife is, what was the wife, right? What was Oolong?
Oh, the slave.
She was a slave. She was a kitchen slave. And then he's just a poor farmer, but they are able to rise up and become wealthy. Their kids become merchants, and they do really well. So that's why I like to assign that. So one thing I like to highlight from this book, and this is kind of a trick question, what do you think of the marriage ceremony in the graphic novel? Why is it a trick question? There was no marriage ceremony. There were marriage ceremonies sometimes in China, but that was for wealthier people. If you were a peasant and you got married, what you did was you had a banquet, you had a feast with your friends, and there was a woman in the house, and she stayed the night in the house. Everyone knows that because it's a village. That means she's your wife. That makes sense. So that's how it's done. It's not through a ritual, but through this kind of public performance. Everyone knows, we're a village, everyone knows everyone. Yeah, she lives with him, that's his wife, right? And they had a banquet, they made it public, his wife. So they did have marriage ceremonies in China, but not typically for poor people, or the feast would be the marriage ceremony. Okay, so one thing I like to highlight, one thing I try and do in this class, at times, I want to emphasize, China isn't something that's out there, in a sense, right? Not only does what goes on in China affects us, there's tariff issues, trade issues right now, of course that affects us, but of course also there are Chinese people in the United States. Ken Yu is here, we've talked about Annie who's here, in a sense they're guests, right, because they're not trying to immigrate, they're just here to study, but of course there's also been Chinese people living in the United States for over a century. One may not as individuals, as families, right? And of course there's Chinese people immigrating to this day. So there is, this kind of long connection. And I have to explain this, then I'll go back to the good earth shortly. Now, one thing that, as you know, the United States has a complicated history of racism, right? And people often use the word racism without really defining it or understanding how there's different forms of racism. There's a really interesting book by this guy named Fujitani. I always forget his first name. I think it's Tak, but it's Fujitani, he's Japanese American. And he wrote a book comparing how Americans treated people of Japanese ancestry living in the United States during World War II. Right, so how did we treat Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants during World War II? And how did the Japanese government treat Koreans during World War II? And he compares them. It's a really good book. And one thing he does is he defines what he calls polite racism and vulgar racism. Right? Vulgar racism versus polite racism. So vulgar racism would be something like calling someone a racial slur. I mean, it's very clear, calling someone using a racial slur. Polite racism is a little bit more complex. So imagine if you're a Chinese American and you were to go to a guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor were to say, "Oh, you're Chinese, you should study math." Because we all know Chinese people are good at math. That's polite racism. The guy's not trying to necessarily be racist, right? But that does sometimes people will do that, right? I see some people's eyes are white. Sometimes that's how it's a stereotype. It's not meant to be mean, it's not meant to denigrate anyone, but it is still, in a sense, a kind of racism. So you probably, unfortunately, are familiar with what's called blackface. Blackface would be an example of vulgar racism. It always existed to denigrate people of African descent. There's also something called yellowface, right? And just if you're not familiar with blackface, blackface was when Caucasians, white people, would dress up like black people and then perform a role in a musical or a movie. And it was, I don't know of any, they were basically always offensive. I've never seen one that's not offensive. Yellowface is similar but different. Yellowface was basically, it would be white people pretending to be Asian. So it's similar in that way. But it was complex because it could be vulgar or polite. Right? Blackface was always vulgar. Yellowfaces can be either one. And this is an example, right? Let me turn off the light so you can see what I'm talking about here. You probably have heard of Fu Manchu. Right? Fu Manchu, especially in terms of the beard or mustache.
Yes, a full one.
It was developed, it's inspired actually by Chinese culture, by Chinese ways of wearing facial hair. And there was a guy in the 1920s and 30s, I think his name was Romer. I always forget the first name. But there was a guy named, I think it was Ernst Romer, who wrote these Fu Manchu series of books about this Chinese guy who was this kind of corrupt, evil, devious Chinese guy, which were kind of the stereotypes Western people had of Chinese people. They're devious. But he had mastered Western technology. And so he was a threat, right? He stayed evil, this kind of devious guy, but he learned to use Western technology, so he was really dangerous. And very racist stuff. And when he was portrayed in movies, it was in yellowface. Right? This is an example, right? So this is actually a white person trying to pretend to be Chinese. And notice there's these horrified white women in the back, and he's carrying a white woman. And this is a more recent film, and you can kind of see the same sort of imagery. Right? That's the same kind of thing. So this is, like I said, what I call yellowface. This is clearly vulgar racism. There was also but we can also see a kind of polite racism, right? So, for example, the book The Good Earth was made into a Hollywood movie in 1937. And that is Oman, the kitchen slave. That's Oman. It's a white person pretending to be Asian. And what's interesting, there's a Chinese American woman who, what she does is she dresses up as these old scenes and replaces them, this is what it would have actually looked at. They would have had a Chinese person do it. Right? Now, what's complex is I call this is more of a, it's complex. This is kind of a polite racism in a sense. I mean, this is bad. They should have just had Chinese people play Chinese people. I mean, don't get me wrong. But the key thing was this was not meant to hurt Chinese people. This was not meant to be a negative movie. So, for example, this movie won Academy Awards. This is the woman who played Olan, Louise Rayner, and she was a big-time actress, and she won an Academy Award for her role in the movie. So this wasn't meant to mock Chinese people, but because of issues of race and so forth, you had white people playing Asian people in yellowface. Right, so you can kind of see that there. And the movie won an Academy Award also for Best Special Effects. So it's a very complex, right? This was seen as a good movie. It won Academy Awards. But again, we have this problem of, like I said, yellowface. What I think is also fascinating about this, 1937 is when the year came out. Okay, if you've taken my classes before, what is so important about the year 1937? Yeah, Chris?
The second Sino-Japanese War.
Excellent, yeah. That is when Japan will invade China. Japan had been pressuring China and had seized parts of Chinese territory before then, but it will actually start a full-scale invasion in 1937. And what's very important about this movie is it helped build sympathy among Americans for Chinese people. Right? It built sympathy for Americans, by Americans for Chinese people. If you watch this movie, it will make you like Chinese people more, if that makes sense. Right? The Chinese are presented in a very positive way. But of course the main characters are white, dressed up like Chinese people, so it's weird. Right? So it's a very complex, there's a lot of depth to it.
It's just a product of its time.
Right, it's a product of its time. It's what I would call polite racism. It's well-intentioned. It's meant to help China and help Chinese people, but it did in kind of racist ways. If that makes sense. And I want to highlight that so we can understand the complex relationship between China, race, and the United States. But also, it is a good movie, despite the whole polite racism thing. So I want to show you a scene from the movie, right? And in particular, because this highlights, like I said, this movie's meant to show the dignity of the peasants. And one thing, it's hard for me to show you that. This is the perfect way to do it, right? To show you a clip from this movie. So as you watch this, I want you to catch what makes a good life for peasants, right? What do peasants want? And one thing I have to absolutely stress, the reason that the communists were able to come to power in China was they promised to give the peasants what they wanted. So if we don't understand what peasants wanted, we can't understand why the communists will come to power. So that's Wang Lun, the farmer. Notice his hair.
Is it a man? Is it a man? A man! A man-child has been born. Behold, we have a son. A man-child! A man-child! I'm a father. And you're a grandfather. I never could get my wife to work the way that woman did, with a child about to be born.
His wife's right there.
If it weren't undignified, I'd tell her that she's a good wife. Nephew, I rejoice with you. It's nothing that I lost my own wheat helping with the child. Nothing. Hear him.
That's the Oad, the former kitchen slave.
get eggs and dye them red for the whole village. Everyone must know I have a son.
So excellent. So that's a good life for the peasants, right? Tianyu, I have to ask, do you know that song?
Yeah, I know it.
I showed it once with when I was in college, a Chinese friend and I watched it, and she started singing along. So that's apparently a very popular, well-known song. So they chose it for that reason. Excellent. So someone who hasn't yet spoken today, right? So how does it start? What's the good thing that happens first? Yeah, he has a son. That's awesome, right? It's feel bad for the ladies, right? Because what's his first question? Is it a man-child? Right? Did I have a boy? And the answer is yes, right? So that's great. And what was his wife looking? Notice how his wife is looking at him. What was she looking for? His wife was looking at him, right? What do you think she was looking at him for? Just kind of like,
Just reaction.
yeah, she's looking for approval. Did I do good? Did I do well? Right? And then remember, he wants to. What's he going to do with eggs? He wants to get eggs, dye them red, do what?
Show them to the town.
Yeah, give them to the village, right? You also want some public respect. And I love how the father said, and I don't know if you would catch this necessarily, but he said, if it wasn't undignified, I would tell her she's a good wife. She could totally hear him, right? It's a small house. And so that's sometimes what you would do. You can't praise someone directly. That's kind of not right. It's not polite. So you just say it in front of, you just say it so they can hear it. Right? So that's just the way politeness worked in traditional Chinese society. So right, so she's, they want respect. They want to have a kid, right? And of course, what was the father so happy, or the Wanlun's father so happy about? Yeah, I'm a grandfather. This is awesome. There's a saying, it's funny, this I think comes out of Confucianism, but my wife from the Philippines says the exact same thing. You can never repay the debt you owe your parents. Right? You can never repay the debt you owe your parents, right? Because they gave you life. But they are life. What can you give them? The closest thing you can do is to have children yourself and make them grandparents. Right? My family's kind of Confucian-style family, so my parents live with us, and they love their grandkids. Me, they just tolerate. But the grandkids, wow, they're happy, right, to have their grandkids around. So that makes them happy. That gives you a sense of security. The family will continue. Right? I did an okay job as a parent because my kids are now married and they have kids. Right? Now, what's interesting, I said this is the good life. What happened next? What did the scene transition into?
Economic prosperity.
Right, economic prosperity. Right, they're becoming wealthy. Right, I love that scene. This is why it won remember this is 1937. This is why it won the Special Effects Award, cinematography. The scene with the kid playing was very well done. Right, he's playing in the grain, and that's very well staged. I'm not a movie critic by any means, but like Armir is saying, this is showing economic prosperity. You've got the chubby baby should be chubby, playing with the food. Right, and then I love the scene where they're pouring out the silver coins. Right, wow, you're doing really well. Copper coins have a hole in them. That's how you know that's copper coins. Those were silver coins. Wow, we're doing really, really well. But notice, they didn't say we don't want to work. Right, their vision of economic prosperity was not I want to make a lot of money so I can be lazy and do nothing. No, it's to work hard and to get to keep the fruits of your labor. And you saw in the comic that that was connected to the acquisition of land. Right? Your dream as a Chinese farmer, if you don't have any land, is to get land. You may say, how can you be a farmer and not have land? Sharecropping. They had sharecropping system as well. But you want to get land, and you ideally want to get more land. As much land as you can get. This agricultural country, wealth flows from the land itself. So that's that idea there. And I made the clip myself. I like to end with a song because it just, you've got your food, you've got your prosperity, you've got your security. You want to have a good time, right? Peasants like to have fun, and it's a kind of I like that because that's a very innocent kind of fun, right? Let's get together and sing, right? Later on, Tanya, I have to ask you what the song is called. I want to see the whole song because that's just a part of it. I think some of the musicians were actually Chinese, and they sang in Chinese, but if you watch the clip closely, the white guy stopped singing. So here's the thing, and this is something we have to remember. And what has happened is, it's in the 19th century, when things are not going well for China, that Europeans and Americans start learning a lot about China. And that's when China's not doing well economically. But in fact, under the Qing, China was doing quite well, and was on the path to economic modernity in many ways. Right? So sometimes people thought of China as a poor country, traditionally. It's one of the wealthiest countries. And this is a quote from this book, Making China Modern. The book's about this thick, which is why I don't assign it to you as a textbook. Right? But I read it. I always try to read new books whenever I can and integrate them into my classes. But I like what this says. Unlike Europe during this period, which was composed of many small states with their own political systems, currencies, national boundaries, and tax systems, Qing China was one vast continental market with few impediments to the movement of goods across provincial boundaries. If you study traditional, like Europe in this time period, it is hard to move goods across any place. There's all these extra taxes you have to pay. China was relatively lenient in this regard and would allow goods to circulate easily. Also, contrary to widespread notions in the West, which imagined the imperial state China to be consistently hostile to private enterprise, the Qing state was active in facilitating commercial growth. So the Qing encouraged the economy, encouraged merchants, encouraged trade. Hence, the Qing government actively nurtured business through various means. One, for example, was the expansion and interlinking of separate road and canal networks to increase the speed of commodity supplies. Right? So they will invest in infrastructure to make, and part of this is for security reasons to move their armies, but also for reasons of trade. And one thing, and I quote this all the time, Chinese is wonderfully efficient in teaching. There's a great saying in Chinese, rich country, strong army. Right? Rich country, strong army. The Qing understood that. Make our country wealthy, our army will be strong, we can conquer, we can maintain power. Another was the stimulation of new production and marketing sectors by offering incentives for enterprises. So this again is a country that is already wealthy, but devastated though by the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing. But in the 18th century, Qing China is going to become increasingly wealthy and powerful thanks to the hard work of the Kangxi emperor and peasants like what we just saw. China will become wealthier. We'll pick up what all that means on Monday. We might even start section 4 on Monday. There's some chance.